Speedscale.
SpeedChat. All right. You're listening to SpeedChat, and we're talking today about ShiftLeft versus ShiftRight. So we've seen a lot of movement in reinventing the software development lifecycle and how it's changed due to agile development, continuous delivery, delivering into clouds. And now we have this concept of ShiftRight that's entering the picture. So I guess we can kind of do this as a point counterpoint. So I have with me Nate Lee and Ken Ahrens from SpeedScale, and we're going to have this little talk about how to contrast the two styles and approaches and what it means. So let's start with ShiftLeft. So, we've been with ShiftLeft forever, and why has it become so popular, and is it still relevant today?
Nate, I think you should go first because I think you're the expert in ShiftLeft.
Well, I mean, it's no secret. We came from the world of service virtualization, and that was primarily a ShiftLeft play, right? From the ITKO days, and I think it's firmly rooted in the conventional waterfall software delivery. Spinning up environments was still, done through VMs and bare metal. It was always reserved for the end of the SDLC. That's where you did all of your testing, right? So anytime you had an opportunity to take that end of the SDLC process and kind of sprinkle it earlier in the lifecycle, that's what kind of ShiftLeft meant to us. And the principle that we would always espouse is, every single time a defect gets from one part of the lifecycle to the next, the defect escape ratio or the leakage, right? At least that's what they taught us in Georgia Tech. And I think it was real. We definitely saw the effects of that at the Fortune 500s. Every single time it goes to the next life cycle, the cost of it increases 10x. So, in theory, if a developer catches it, it's $10. If it gets into unit testing, maybe it's $100, so on and so forth. That's what ShiftLeft means to me. And I think things kind of got turned on its head when people started adopting Agile and there wasn't a clearly defined test phase anymore.
Yeah, I want to kind of add on to what you said there, Nate. I think ShiftLeft is great. If you're finding defects way too late in the cycle, what about finding things earlier? And a lot of what we actually discovered was when you were in a waterfall process, when you got to that testing phase, if things weren't really buttoned down, you would have a lot of testers and they'd be sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for the environment to be ready. And so anything you could do to figure out those kinds of problems early were great value because you wouldn't be paying for people sitting around. So ShiftLeft is great, as its own concept. I just think a lot of companies aren't developing software that way anymore.
So what do you think is leading to this? I mean, do you think there's some kind of heresy around talking about shifting right now? Are we somehow discouraging people from shifting left by talking about shift right? Or how did this come about that we would consider this an acceptable alternative to shift left practices?
Just like I said, I liked shift left. I like shift right too. So it sort of depends on your organization and who you are. And I think what's happened is as the big cloud giants have come out and started to open up on how they do their software development practices, people were surprised to find they didn't have a long defined testing phase. They tried to reduce as much as possible the time between the code being written by a developer and putting it in production in front of customers. And when you remove that phase, the idea of left doesn't make sense. You can't go any further left. So they started saying, let's shift right. We still need to do this quality phase, but we'll do it in the production environment. So I think this it's just an alternative when you're trying to move really fast. You still want to know if the code is any good. Let's at least try to discover it in production. And I think that's becoming more popular nowadays because people want to move really fast and they value agility over quality.
It's kind of in line with what you're saying, Ken, but I also think there's I like to examine kind of the human nature side of things too. There was once a customer I visited, as a big retailer in North Carolina, and they said, we just do all of our testing in production. And it was at the time where all we did was shift left testing, right? So it was shocking to hear that all they did was test in production. And they did point out a couple key things like, hey, we have to stop right before we do the payment checkouts because we can't actually invoke any payments because that would wreck our records and financial P&Ls and all that stuff. And so there were some pretty big gaps in what they were doing, but eventually, looking back at them, I'm like, were they thought leaders or were they doing what they had to do? And then the industry caught up and named it something, right? And I think there's a little bit of both really that's going on. And how do we get there, I think is important to examine. And I think the way we got there is, I heard one of the fintechs here in Georgia say, it's like we adopted Agile and we forgot to bring quality along with us, right? Agile had no clearly defined test phase. The developers now wear multiple hats. There's a you build it, you own it mentality, right? And so developers need to do all of these things. And when you're crunched on time and you got a 2-week sprint, there's not any real methodologies or tools that allow you to do all of that in the sprint. So I think in some ways, we just defaulted to, well, we're going to push it out the door, but as a failsafe, we will apply tons and tons of monitoring, which is great. Ken, did you want to say something?
Well, so yeah, I think that ShiftRight's better than nothing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So doing nothing's a bad idea. So we're just going to write code, check it into production, go to lunch, right? Obviously, that's not a great idea. ShiftRight at least says, let's do it in a safe way. And remember, we shared that article from GitHub where they talked about, we put the release out to 2% of the users. We collect metrics to understand how it's going. And one of their findings was, and GitHub's one of the biggest sites in the world, 2% of traffic was not enough. They still would get a good feeling sometimes and push it to 100% and find out they had a problem. So they added a stage in between. So first we do 2%, then we do 20%, and then we make sure that everything's still working great. Then we push out. And I think that's an example of showing the problems with ShiftRight. So if you completely depend upon the production environment to supply all your quality signals, then it's going to become really hard. And this is cumbersome to deploy.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of synergy between ShiftLeft and ShiftRight in the sense that you kind of need both if you're going to get there, because you almost have to accept the fact that some problems will always escape into production, especially when you have so many interdependencies that you could never possibly test for all of the scenarios that could occur in the real world. Would you say what kind of scenarios would you say are not fit for ShiftRight? I mean, it seems like perhaps if I was like an Airbnb or a YouTube or some company like that, I mean, the world's not going to end if somebody can't see their video or book a room that day. But there's other scenarios that it may not be a great fit for. So what are your thoughts there?
So actually, I really like this question, Jason, because a lot of these best practices are coming from companies like Netflix, like Google, that have a different kind of business model than others. Even Airbnb, actually. So a lot of people are browsing on Airbnb versus how many are transacting. And if you compare that to something like we're working with a company who has an online ordering system, when someone's on your mobile app trying to do a transaction, you don't want to use them as a test case. Because if you're wrong about, the version of the code they're running, the order will fail. And the blowback, anyway, you have a direct revenue impact there. Versus, I think, Google and Netflix have a different model, especially Netflix, actually, they have a subscription model. So they make the same from the customer, whether they have their video served or not. So certainly there's different kinds of industries. And then also, let's not use ShiftRight as a crutch and say, okay, testing's so impossible, we don't need to try. You should make some attempts to see if the code is any good before you get it into customers' hands.
Yeah, I think just to your last point, Ken, I think the right answer, the right balance is always somewhere in between, right? You got to do some shift left to mitigate your risk and shift right because there are some true benefits, right? You're capturing all of the use cases that the customers are doing. There's a lot more volume you can do. And there's just some things that you can't replicate until you do testing in production, right?
One of the things I like about sort of ShiftRight versus a traditional approach to testing. So in a traditional approach to testing, you have to think of all the use cases. You have to try to code them all. You have to try to say, what if a user does this or that? And a lot of times it ends up being a little too clean, a little too pristine, because you have to tear down the environment and start over. And when you get to production, it's messy. So the good thing about ShiftRight is you see the messiness, you see all the traffic coming in, all the different calls, and the app has to handle it. When we did an install with a customer recently, we noticed how much of their traffic was coming from the monitoring systems themselves. It was actually about half the traffic was the monitoring systems hitting it. That happens for real in production. If you forget to size that, and half your traffic is monitoring, you could have it sized wrong. So it's actually one of the things that we're trying to account for with SpeedScale is have that realistic thing. We're not guessing. We're not trying to say, how do you think users use it? It's what really happens in the system.
Yeah, those unhappy paths are impossible to perceive until you see them, right? And that's just, it's going to be the reality going forward from here, I think. I mean, part of the new reality is the fact that we're able, just based on the advent of cloud, we're able to store so much more data and use so much more data in our release process than we ever could before. And at the same time, having things like, containerization and APIs as sort of this reference model. So you have these kind of two forces that are combining to make ShiftRight possible now where it wasn't before, right? I don't think it would have been possible to do this in an old 3-tier system because we just didn't have the bandwidth or capacity to keep all that data. So, what do you think about how this came about, or how the capability is kind of caught up with the practice itself?
So I actually think your point about containerization, APIs, what it's done is it's made the application a lot more modular. I don't have to take down the entire system to make a change. We don't have to have, you'll notice people typically don't have maintenance windows anymore, except with rare exceptions. So I can just replace just the one component. And this is actually one of the drivers why that facilitates the need for ShiftRight. It's too hard to build the environment in pre-production that looks the same way. But on the SpeedScale side, we're taking advantage of the cloud data warehouse technology, and we're actually sucking in all of the API calls and building. It's not a model. We're building the actual calls that flow through the system during a period of time, and then we let you replay that against the next version. So it's totally different than this idea of trying to guess what users are doing. And we'll also lock in all the back-end dependencies. How did they respond during that time? Did they send errors? People are always asking that. Well, how come that sent an error? Well, your system normally gets an error. So you need to respond that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing that you called out, Jason, I thought was interesting is what people are really pursuing with ShiftRight testing. And I think there's some of that experimentation, A/B testing, right, to find out what customer preferences are. But there's an aspect of like exploratory testing and tuning that they're trying to do, right, with chaos engineering, making sure what's going to happen if they can harden systems. And that's one of the things that I think SpeedScale's done a good job of doing is providing a lot of the ShiftRight benefits of that exploratory testing, tuning, change things and then retest, change things and retest, that iterative process. But we've managed to shift that left where there isn't nearly the risk that you have with breaking something that people are actually using. So capturing that intent and accomplishing the goal in a different way has been a strong suit of SpeedScale's.
I guess we're shifting left, shift right every day.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Jason. We took your shift right and shifted it left for you. So.
Yeah. Well, I at what point do you call it continuous testing, right? I don't know. I know that there's some people who say that, but I mean, regardless, the end game is, your system doesn't ever go down, especially when you're a banking company and you click, complete deposit, and then it says something went wrong. Like, is your money still there? Did it disappear in the ether? Did a Bitcoin server eat it? Like, what happened?
Yeah. Well, cool. I think this is a pretty good discussion. Thanks for joining me. But yeah, it's kind of fun to talk about. We should revisit it again with some more of our insights from the field. But thanks for joining me.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot, Jason.
Pleasure.
Cool.